Uncertain without being anxious. Okay, well, that's every kid on Christmas Eve. We know there's no fear there. Okay, it's when you combine the two that we generate this fear response. This fear response is really what we're talking about. The uncertainty you and I are talking about right now is the uncertainty that is uncertainty plus anxiety, because people are feeling that fear. And so I think what we have to understand first is that we're dealing less with uncertainty and more with fear. So we have to ask ourselves, okay, what in fact are we afraid of? And then if we break it down to those components, uncertainty, anxiety, can we buy down our anxiety? Can we buy down our uncertainty? Okay. Buying down anxiety could be as simple as doing breath work, kind of calming yourself, doing things that make us joyful, things like that. It could be reframing, and I'll talk about that in a second. Buying down uncertainty are those techniques that we're going to get to that are in the book, and how you actually generate your environment, or you create an environment that actually you then become certain about and you take control.
Rich Diviney, welcome back to the show. I am so happy to sit down with you again, because you were on the podcast back in, I believe, 2020, and we were talking about your book at the time that is called The Attributes, and it's 25 hidden drivers of optimal performance. And so now coming back on the show, we're going to talk about your newest book, which is Masters of Uncertainty, the Navy SEAL Way to Turn Stress into Success for you and your team. And we were kind of talking about this offline of how uncertainty is definitely a season we are in. And we don't know how long we'll be in this season, but it's something we all experience. And so perfect timing for you to be on the show. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Erica. It's great to be back. Thanks for having me back. So I'm excited to chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So there's one truth, as I mentioned, the one thing we could all agree with is that the only certainty we all have is that there is uncertainty, and it will always show up for all of us. Doesn't matter if you're SEAL or just the average person. Mm-hmm. And so SEALs are known as the masters of uncertainty. And I kind of want to dive deep into why that's the case, and how can we as listeners cultivate the same type of foundation, so that when stress or challenges or any type of uncertainty that we will all experience, we could handle it with ease, and also with the confidence that we could go through it. Mm-hmm. So you open up the book, which I was just reading your book, and it's a great read. Of course, it will be in the show notes, everybody. It's a quick read. I loved it, and I definitely highlighted, and I'm going to go back to it. But anyways, you talk about in the top of the book, you talk about the Bin Laden raid.
Yeah.
And I think this is really important to pull out, because everybody's familiar with that, or at least the gist of it.
Yeah.
And you're explaining this story, I think, to highlight the times of uncertainty, but yet how we could persevere with precision and success regardless of. So if you could kind of dive into that a little bit.
Yeah. So I think, well, to kind of highlight something you said previously, is that this idea that uncertainty is everywhere. I mean, it is the one thing we can count upon, but that's not a bad thing. I mean, we as human beings live in an inherently uncertain environment. We are actually designed for it. And we were actually designed to actually go through it, and actually, in some cases, many cases, step deliberately into it. This is exactly what's caused our species to go from cave dweller to space explorer. We like that. What I will say is this ability to, and so what makes the SEALs different, or what makes the SEALs masters of uncertainty, is it's really this idea that it's not like the TV or movies would have you believe. It's not about the shooting or the skydiving or the scuba diving. It's the fact that SEALs are individuals and teams that can drop into deep complexity and perform. And now, one thing I will say, you mentioned with confidence and ease. I will say yes with confidence, not so much with ease. Ease may or may not be present for any one of us during uncertainty, but ease is actually not what we're looking for. It may be difficult, it may be tough, but that's not a bad thing. Certainly confidence, and I think confidence is the key word there, because if we can find ourselves in a position where we can say to ourselves, hey, no matter what happens, I'll figure it out. Or even more powerfully say, hey, I want to go explore that, and I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to deliberately put my foot into it. That's really where the true growth and evolution comes. So that's what I get real excited about in terms of the concept.
You know, it's funny that you pulled out that I said ease. I'm having an interview after this that is about ease, by the way. So that's why it was at top of mind. But it's so true. I love that you said it's not exactly ease, but yet, I feel that confidence comes with competence.
Hmm.
And so I think that the ease I'm thinking of when I said that out loud was more the competence that you could move through it.
Yes, yeah. It's I often define confidence as belief with evidence. Okay, so whereas faith in many cases is belief without evidence. Okay, but belief with evidence means that we have the ability to we have the evidence, we have proof on our side that we've actually done these things before, and we've moved through these scenarios or this environment before. The good thing is that when we start talking about these concepts that I talk about in the book, pretty much every human being that reads this book has done this stuff before. So we all have evidence. We all should be able to develop confidence from this evidence. We have to just interrogate what we've done and begin to articulate it and repeat it over and over again. And that's really where confidence lies. And I think that, again, that's in my mind, when people ask me what true confidence is, it is this ability to be able to say, you know what, I'm, no matter what happens as I move through life, I'll figure it out. It may be dirty, it may be ugly, it might be gritty, it might be hard, but I'll figure it out. I'll move through it. And I think that's a superpower in many cases.
Absolutely. So going back to the Bin Laden raid,
Yes.
this example, can you explain why you share that example at the top of the book?
Yeah. So first of all, because like you said, it's probably one of the most well-known military operations in history. We can't deny that. And it's always good if, especially as a SEAL, I happen to, as someone who was at that command. I was not on the mission, but was at the command, and many of my friends were on that mission. It was kind of neat to be able to understand what happened there and kind of what was in fact required. Now, really, most of the world knows. The mission came up rather quickly. The guys who were assigned to it, they were flown to this area. They began training on a mock facility, and they did rehearsal after rehearsal over the course of several days, just to kind of really try to routinize and perfect their strategy, their mission plan on this. And so they were very well rehearsed in almost every aspect of that mission. But we all know that as soon as they hit the target for real, uncertainty struck because one of the helicopters crashed, and so that immediately changed the dynamic. And it's a cascading, any mission, really anything you're doing, but certainly military missions. If one thing happens at the beginning, it's usually a cascade of things that will change the mission downstream. So that in effect created more uncertainty and more new things that had to be dealt with along the way. But we all know that we all know the result. The result is etched in history, where the guys were able to get Bin Laden and return unscathed. And so, other than I think a minor bullet wing on one of the guys, but largely unscathed. And so it's a testament to this idea that when the best laid plans are well rehearsed and expected, things aren't going to go as planned. I mean, and success is incumbent on being able to flex and adapt and move through this uncertainty versus having a great plan and being able to execute a great plan. And that's, I think, the point. And in life, we should really, all of us should think about our lives this way, not in the seriousness or at the stakes that the SEAL missions are at, of course. However, if we have the ability to say, you know what, as I move through life, I just know I'll be able to flex and adapt. Man, it's a great aspect to have. So I felt that was a cool way to start the book, and just to let people know this is not a Navy SEAL thing. This is a human thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And just out of curiosity, because when you were sharing this story, I was thinking about, I forgot where I originally heard this. I think it was from like basketball teams, like basketball players. They actually, or sorry, it was somebody that coaches. I think it was David Nurse, if you're familiar with him.
I know Dave. Yeah, he's a great guy.
Yeah. I think it was him that shared on the podcast that, and maybe it was actually a couple people that coach all-star teams, but sharing that they actually plan for what could go wrong.
Yes. Yeah.
Is that something that you also share as part of this method to handle uncertainty?
Yes. Well, yes, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I don't think any of this precludes proper planning. However, what we can't do, and what Navy SEALs never do, is overplan or suffer paralysis through analysis type thing. So in any mission, our missions are usually phased into five phases, and for each one of those phases, we say, okay, what's the one or two things that could go wrong in this phase? We generate a plan. And then we have something in our back pocket, but we don't overplan. We recognize that there's a lot of things that could happen that we did not anticipate, and we're not going to waste our time worrying about things we can't anticipate. But what planning does is it allows you an element of being able to free up your brain to execute on things that you don't necessarily have to worry about. So in other words, if I plan for contingency A and contingency B, that means that we all have that rehearsed. It's in our back pocket. So if one of those happens, I can just execute that plan. I don't have to worry about. It's not uncertain to me anymore. I can open my aperture for dealing with other things. So planning is a good idea, but over planning is not a good idea. And worrying about things that we can't control is not only not a good idea, but it's also an enormous waste of energy. So we don't want to do that.
So how do you know what is too much planning, like over planning? Like
Well,
what's the line?
that's a great question. My sense is that answer would be subjective. However, I won't gaff off the question. I think my guess would be planning. The proper amount of planning is kind of the number of things that seem like they are in a reasonably high percentage that could happen. And so the example would be, so for a mission, I say each phase of the mission, we probably have 2 or 3 contingencies. So if one of the phases is we're flying in a helicopter, then one of the plans would be a helicopter crashes. What do we do? Okay, that's one thing. Another phase, it might be we get contacted, or so it might be 1 or 2 things per phase. In parachute operations, there's approximately 5 kind of well-known, most common parachute malfunctions that happen when you jump out of an airplane and pull your parachute, right? And so planning is, okay, let me just make sure I understand those 5s and what those 5 things and what I'm going to do for those 5 things. Other than that, it's kind of up in the air as to what can happen. You might have a combination, you might have this and that, but you don't necessarily have to worry about that. So I think it's a matter of understanding, okay, what's coming forward, or what are we going to do? What are the 1 or 2 most likely things that could happen? And have a plan and go there. But I think if you find yourself stewing, if you find yourself worrying, if you find yourself trying to be creative about what might go wrong, that's when you might be stepping over the line on paralysis through analysis.
Yeah, that's so good to know, because I think that there's this thing with perfection, right? People want to be like perfectly planned, like how they're going to attack. But like you said, that then leads to procrastination because it's too big of a goal to reach. And so, which we're going to talk into how to break that down. And this is such a key component, because I've learned through what you share a lot in this book, and also what we're going to talk about in this conversation today, is how somebody like you, since you're a former SEAL, you served over 20 years, if I'm correct, going through Hell Week and the training for to become a SEAL, it very much comes down to how you break down each task so that you're not looking at the big goal, like I want to be a SEAL. You're actually looking at, how do I complete the next thing? Yeah. And then the next thing. So we'll go deep into this, because this is a big component of what you talk about today, which is absolute gold. But before I mention that, I talked about how we are in a high level of uncertainty right now with the tariffs, with AI, with, of course, new leadership. People are going crazy. Yeah. Like that's the headline in the news, like all this chaos of uncertainty, right? Recession and, yada, yada. And it's one thing that's so apparent on people's minds is that level of stress. And so out of curiosity, how should people be, if you want to say, looking at this uncertainty? Is there a different way they should maybe think about it, act upon it, or not act on it? Like, what would your advice be to people right now in this time of uncertainty, how we should address it?
Yeah, no, I think first of all, we have to define it properly and understand what we're actually talking about. Uncertainty in of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It's really uncertainty combined with a couple other things. And so And so one of my good friends is Andrew Huberman, Huberman Lab podcast. He and I did a lot of work together. In fact, a lot of the stuff in the book is stuff we worked on when we first met, 7 or 8 years ago. But one of the things we talk about, or we kind of determined as we were looking at this stuff together, was what is in fact fear. He was running a fear lab at the time at Stanford. And so we were really both interested in fear, him from a neurological level, me from a kind of an experiential level. And one of the things we decided upon was that fear is, in fact, a combination of two factors. Those two factors are uncertainty plus anxiety. Okay, so in other words, you could have one or the other, and you don't necessarily have fear. You can have anxiety but no uncertainty. That would be, you have a presentation to give next week at work. The people you're giving it to, the presentation. So there's no uncertainty there. You're just maybe a little anxious about, how it's going to go or whatever, how it's going to be perceived. So there's not necessarily fear there. You can be uncertain without being anxious. Okay, well, that's every kid on Christmas Eve. And we know there's no fear there. Okay, it's when you combine the two that we generate this fear response. This fear response is really what we're talking about. The uncertainty you and I are talking about right now is the uncertainty that is uncertainty plus anxiety, because people are feeling that fear. And so I think what we have to understand first is that we're dealing less with uncertainty and more with fear.
True.
So we have to ask ourselves, okay, what in fact are we afraid of? And then if we break it down to those components, uncertainty, anxiety, can we buy down our anxiety? Can we buy down our uncertainty? Okay. Buying down anxiety could be as simple as doing breath work, kind of calming yourself, doing things that make us joyful, things like that. It could be reframing, and I'll talk about that in a second. Buying down uncertainty are those techniques that we're going to get to that are in the book, and how you actually generate your environment, or you create an environment that actually you then become certain about and you take control. But one of the ways, if possible, that one can look at this, and again, this is easier said than done, it's not always possible, is while uncertainty plus anxiety equal fear, uncertainty plus curiosity equals excitement. And so one of the strategies that sometimes works, again, easier said than done, is to reframe your anxiety into curiosity. But again, we have to think about anxiety as what it is. Anxiety is always in front of us. It's always in the future. Okay. It's never the now. Stress is now. Anxiety is future. And we all know, like, while the past is history, the future is fiction. Okay. So anxiety is literally fiction. That's what it is. So what are we actually anxious about? Can we, in fact, be curious about it instead and turn that uncertainty into excitement? Now, easier said than done. One of the examples I give of this is the fact that I think we talked about this last time because it's in the first book. I hate heights. So parachuting was always an issue for me. I always had to really work through my fear to jump out of airplanes. As a result of that, or in congruent with that, I also hate roller coasters. I just don't like them. Too high, too fast, too out of control, all that stuff. My wife loves roller coasters. She can't get enough of them. And so when we are sitting on a roller coaster, my wife and I next to each other, we go on the exact same ride. And she's feeling anxiety plus curiosity and excitement, and I'm feeling anxiety plus uncertainty plus anxiety equals fear. So at the end of that ride, if I haven't done any work, then I am absolutely exhausted and pissed off, and she wants to ride again. And so one of the ways I've done this, in fact, I went on a roller coaster with her a couple of weeks ago. It was her birthday. We were at Universal Studios, and she asked me to go on the fastest roller coaster they have, which is like the Velociraptor or something like that. And so of course I said, okay. And I remember saying to myself, okay, you know what? I'm just going to try to turn my anxiety into curiosity and say, I'm just going to pretend I'm on a fighter. I'm like flying a fighter jet or something like that. I've always wanted
That's
to
amazing.
and try that. And I tried it, and it actually worked to a degree. I mean, it was, I can't, it was certainly an intense ride. And afterwards I was somewhat depleted. Yes, but it did work. And so we have to just, I think part of the process, other than the things we're going to get into, the specific tools, is to just name it, call it what it is. We are the reason we feel what we feel is because there's fear there. The reason why there's fear there is because there's uncertainty plus anxiety. Can we, in fact, either reframe or buy down our anxiety to a degree to minimize that fear? That's one strategy. And then, of course, we'll talk about how we, in fact, buy down our uncertainty as well.
It's so great. I love that. I love what you shared. That's so fascinating that you are fearful or somewhat fearful of roller coasters when, like, you've been on a wild ride. I mean, to say the least. So it's kind of interesting.
It's all subjective. Fear is all subjective. That's what we have to understand. Because again, you could have a group of Navy SEALs in a gunfight with Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, literally in that moment, feeling less fear than the 8-year-old you just asked to step in front of the classroom and introduce themselves. So we just have to be very empathetic and cognizant about fear for human beings.
Oh, for
And that's,
sure.
I don't
Yes.
judge it at all. I really don't. I mean, there are people, that's why people they're generally anxious people who walk around and they actually have high levels of courage because they're constantly stepping into their fear and discomfort. So
Absolutely.
it is quite subjective.
So true. So true. So before we get into the goodness, the meat and the bones of this conversation, can you share with us the difference between peak performance and optimal performance? Because you were very particular when you named your first book. It was the attributes, the 25 hidden drivers of optimal performance.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
so I'd love people to know the difference.
Yeah, the difference is that I just don't like this fascination with that people have with peak performance, and I see it all the time. Everybody wants to be peak here, peak there, and peak everywhere. It's all about peak performance, and people used to tell me, you Navy SEALs are the ultimate peak performers, and I used to disagree with that. I used to say no, that's not the case, and the reason is because peak, by definition, is an apex, and there's only one place you can go from an apex, and that's down. Okay. The other thing about peak is peak often has to be planned for or scheduled or prepared for. So in other words, the professional football player plans and schedules his entire week so that he can peak for 3 hours on Sunday. Okay. We don't get to do that. Navy SEALs don't get to do that. Regular human beings don't get to do that. So I would always say we are in fact optimal performers. I said, an optimal performance means I'm going to do the very best in the moment, whatever the best looks like in that moment. Now, sometimes our best in the moment looks like peak, and it's flow states and everything's clicking, everything's awesome and groovy and cool. Sometimes, though, our best in the moment is I am just literally head down, slogging it out, going step by step, because that's all I have. And it's dirty and it's gritty and it's ugly and it's hard. That is still performing optimally, and we have to recognize that. And so optimal performance allows us a couple very important things. First of all, it allows us to celebrate those times when we are not at peak, because we can't be peak all the time. I can't tell you how many SEAL missions we went on and we'd come back from the operation, we'd be like, man, that was ugly, but we still got the job done. Okay. So it can't be peak all the time. We have to celebrate that. The other thing it allows us is responsible energy management. In other words, I don't have to be peak when I'm driving to the grocery store. I could be at some other energy level. There's you might see there's a myth I'll bust about SEALs because you might see it on TV or movies. You might see a group of SEALs, they're hoo-yawing and high-fiving before they go on some sort of mission, right? And that never happens. We're never doing that, right? In fact, we would be in the helicopter flying into combat, and the guys around me, for the most part, were sleeping. They were taking naps, And there's a reason for that. It's because we don't know what's coming. We don't know how long we're going to be out there. We don't know what's going to be required of us energetically. We're not going to waste an ounce of our energy doing things we don't need to do. And so optimal performance allows us this energy modulation, which is absolutely essential in any form of long game performance, which is all of us are in a long game, or at least we should be striving to be in a long game. So.
Yeah. I love that you talk about that, because I think the energy management is a huge component. And that kind of leads me to what you talk about is, especially in the SEAL teams, like going through Hell Week.
Mm-hmm.
The only way, in my opinion, when I've heard about it and heard other SEALs talk about it, is how you manage your energy throughout that whole entire Hell Week, because you're depleted of energy because you're only sleeping, 2-3 hours in the whole entire 5 days.
Yeah.
And so if you don't manage your energy, there's no way you could accomplish that. And so how could people take what you've learned in the SEALs training and Hell Week, and obviously being a SEAL yourself, how could we take that into our life in managing our energy in everything we do in our life?
Well, I think now's a great segue into the moving horizons concept, because this is how we do it, So the beginning of the book, I talk about the things we have to know about ourselves neurologically when it comes to uncertainty, challenge, and stress, and what our brain is in fact trying to do, and why there's friction there. And so one of the things we have to understand is that our brain is trying to figure out and make certain our environments at all times. It's just basically, okay, I've seen this before. When have I seen it? What's going on? How long? What is this around me? We're trying to define our environment. 3 aspects that our brain is looking for that are very important in that defining process are duration, how long this is going to last; pathway, what's my route in, out, or through; and then outcome, what's the end state that I can expect once this is all over. If we are in absence of one or more of those, duration, pathway, outcome, or DPO, we begin to feel uncertainty. Uncertainty starts to rise, and that starts to induce stress. It starts to, in some cases, induce fear. So here's an example. So you and I say you and I get strep throat. Okay, strep throat is a known illness that has a known antibiotic. Okay, we also know that most people don't die from strep throat. So if we get strep throat, we have a pathway, an antibiotic, and we have an outcome. We're going to get better. What we don't have is a duration, because you may respond to antibiotics a little bit differently than I do. So you might feel better in one day. It might take me 2 or 3 days to feel better. So our uncertainty level, and in some cases anxiety level, is mild. Now, say you and I get the flu. Okay, now the flu is also a known disease, and we know most people nowadays don't die from the flu, but the flu does not have a known cure. In other words, there's no medicine you can necessarily take for the flu. There's some techniques and strategies that people throw at you, but there's no known thing that you can take. So in that case, we know the outcome, we're going to get better, but we're absent the duration, how long it's going to take for us to get better, and the pathway, what we're supposed to do to get better. We'll try some things, but we're not too sure. So our uncertainty or anxiety is at a moderate level. Now let's imagine a disease hits the world that no one's seen before. All right, there's no known cure or vaccine, and then some people are dying, some people are not dying, and we don't know how long this is going to be with us. Okay, this might sound familiar because this is 2020, right? This is COVID. Okay, in that case, we are in absence of duration, pathway, outcome, and that's when really maximum uncertainty and anxiety start to bubble up. So all we talk about, all this process of moving horizons is when you're in an environment of uncertainty, when you're in absence of a DPO, you simply look at, you take a step back, you look at your environment, your situation, you ask yourself, what do I know and what can I control? And in essence, you pick something to focus on, to head for, a horizon. And by doing so, you create for yourself a duration, pathway, outcome. You create a DPO. Okay, so the example will just go to Hell Week. Okay, in Hell Week, SEAL training Hell Week, you spend hundreds of hours running around with these big, heavy boats on your head. In fact, everywhere you go, you have to run with these boats on your head all the time. It's miserable. And I remember, it was probably 2 a.m, one of the nights of Hell Week, and we're running on the beach with this damn boat, and we're all miserable. I'm certainly miserable. And we're running alongside of a sand berm. And I remember saying to myself, you know what? I'm just going to focus on getting to the end of the sand berm. And what I did without knowing it is I created for myself, I picked a horizon and created for myself a DPO, duration, pathway, outcome. Duration from now until I get to the end of the sand berm, pathway from here to end of sand berm, and an outcome, end of sand berm. As soon as I did that, I created a small goal, which allowed my dopamine system to kick in and motivated me to keep going. And then it also created a reward when I reached that goal that allowed me to get a dopamine hit and come back, pick a new horizon, and focus on something else. And so what this is essentially doing for us in any environment, but specifically the ones that we have uncertainty in, is it's creating certainty inside of an uncertain environment. You're taking all this uncertainty, you're basically creating a certain thing that you can focus on, moving to that, and in essence, creating a reward system that allows you to keep going by utilizing your dopamine effectively. This can be done in any environment. It doesn't, in fact, you don't even have to have, you can practice this in environments with not a lot of uncertainty. You can practice this. Most of us do. A lot of us who work out, we do this in the gym all the time. We don't feel like doing the workout. We don't feel like doing a particular set of squats or whatever. So, you know what, I'm just going to focus on just doing this set. I'll worry about everything else, later, right? So, or I'll get through this and worry about that later. This is why when I said at the beginning of the conversation here, every single human has done this to some capacity in their lives. We can all think of times where we have effectively chunked our environment. And what it is it's the neurological equivalent of eating the elephant one bite at a time. But what we have to understand is we're accessing parts of our neurology that are very important and very powerful, because we are basically, like I said, we're buying down that uncertainty piece. We're actually taking away anxiety altogether, because whatever we focus on, the horizon we're focusing on, there's no doubt there. So there's no anxiety about it. So in picking a horizon, creating DPO, we're immediately getting rid of uncertainty plus anxiety. And this is also how fear goes away. People say, how did you jump out of airplanes hundreds of times when you didn't like it, when you were afraid to do it? It's because every time I did, all I was doing was going horizon to horizon. As I was going up in the air, I was thinking about my emergency procedures. As I'm getting ready to stand up, I'm looking at my gear. As I'm looking at the ramp, I'm saying, just nail the exit. That's how I'm focused on. Get out and get stable. Once I'm stable, pull my parachute. All it is a process of continuously shifting those horizons. And I'm going to shut up here in a second, but we can talk about how those horizons can move in terms of the size and duration and bite-sized pieces we need to focus on.
What you just shared right now, I honestly think this is gold. It is such gold to accomplishing anything in life. And also, like you said, removing the fear of doing things that are outside our comfort zone. Because generally speaking, when something's outside of what we know or are familiar with, we feel this anxiety or fear that's just natural that comes up. But the only way to grow is being outside our comfort zone. And so I just think what you share today is such gold. And I think it could change people's lives. And so I'm just curious, when you went into Hell Week or SEALs training, was this ever taught? Like, this is you guys, this is what you focus on. You don't think about the big goal. I want to ring the bell at the end. You think about like just getting, through this. And then were you like, was this taught well, I'm curious, was it taught then? And is it taught now?
So
Like,
the answer is no on both fronts.
that's
However,
insane.
but I can't say, I have to say it's not, it was not taught, nor is it taught today in the way I'm describing it. However, you always got clues in what people were saying. I remember people saying, "Hey, just focus on the next meal, or make it to the next meal, or just do the O course and focus on that." Whatever. People used to say that all the time, offhanded. It was they were basically verbalizing their strategy, and their strategy is in fact this. There's a saying actually when you're going into Hell Week in the student body is if you think about Friday of Hell Week on Monday, you're going to quit. Guaranteed, and there's a lot of people they've been doing debriefs now for years. The guys who quit, they sit down and debrief them. So many of those guys, when they talk about, hey, what happened? They're like, well, I was doing this, and I just started thinking about like what was coming, or what tomorrow, or how long I had. You're done. You're just done.
Yeah, how long left, or whatever.
Yeah, I did not think about Friday of Hell Week until Friday of Hell Week. So I think it was always. It was always kind of insinuated in the way people talked about what their personal strategies were. But I think what I've been fascinated with and what I'm doing now is articulating this in a way that can be repeated and then taught.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, so moving horizons, and how do we determine which horizon to pick? Because I know you've shared, as I've listened to some of your conversations, you don't want to pick that horizon too short or too long. You kind of got to be in the sweet spot. So how do we determine the sweet spot?
Yeah, the sweet spot has everything to do with dopamine. And dopamine, there's so much good stuff about dopamine. Huberman has had a couple podcasts, and I think Anna Lemke wrote a book on dopamine as well. All we need to know in layman's terms about dopamine is not necessarily just a reward chemical. It's in fact a motivation chemical. Dopamine tells us this is good, keep doing this, or it motivates us to even get up and start moving. They did an experiment with rats where they took one group of rats, and they had it in a little cage here, and the rat had access to a lever that the rat would push, and they get a really tasty pellet. Okay, so first group obviously sitting next to the lever and just pushing that lever, getting pellet after pellet. Then they took another group of rats, and what they did was they took all the dopamine. They removed the dopamine from that group of rats. And when the group of rats was moved, even a rat length away from that lever, those rats wouldn't even move to the lever. They wouldn't even get up and start moving. And so what they recognize is dopamine is part of what gets us up in the morning, gets us moving. And so why does this matter? It's because when we pick a horizon, we are basically picking something that's initiating this dopamine, this anticipation of doing something, and it's initiating this dopamine response. If the horizon is too far away, if it's too long, we're actually going to run out of dopamine before we get there. Okay. That is what quitting is. If we quit something, it's because we've ran out of dopamine on the way. We picked too long of a horizon. What happens if we pick too short of a horizon is we don't register a big enough of a reward to make it meaningful. Okay. A quick example, and I talk about this when I do my talks, is and I actually talk about in the book, a guy named George who I met at a conference, and George walked up to me after this conference, and he introduced himself, said he was an ultra runner. Now, for your audience, I'm sure most of them know ultra running is like 50 to 100-mile running races where people run. So it's crazy running. And I said, how did you become an ultra runner? And he said, well, you're not going to believe this, but I used to be 450 pounds or something like that. And I was like, holy crap. I was like, tell me more. Now I want to really hear the story. And he said, well, one day I was so unhealthy that I decided, I'm going to set a goal for myself and run a marathon. but I have to start running. So I said, what'd you do? He's like, well, first thing I did is I went home, and I made that decision. I went home. First thing I did is I said, get online. I'm going to buy running shoes, which is what he did. Running shoes came. He said, okay, running shoes came. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to get up and I'm going to put on my running shoes. That's what he did. Next morning, he said, put on my running shoes. I'm going to walk to the front door. Next morning, put on my running shoes, walk to the mailbox, so on and so forth. So he kept on picking horizons that were meaningful for him. So now I try to run if I can. If I'm lucky and I'm not traveling too much, I try to run at least a couple times a week. If there's a certain stint of time where I don't get to run for a couple months and I have to go back to running, all right, it's not going to be meaningful enough for me to put on my running shoes and walk out to the mailbox. That's
Right.
That's not a meaningful enough DPO, or not a meaningful horizon. For me, it might be, well, maybe I'll just go do 3 hills instead of 5 hills, or whatever that is. So all this to say is horizons are always subjective to the individual, and they're subjective to the intensity of the environment. So in other words, the more intense the environment, the shorter often the horizon has to be. Hell Week, again, you spend enough SEALs, but you spend tons of hours freezing in the surf zone, like surf torture and all that stuff. I mean, and actually, that most guys quit SEAL training because of the cold, not because of the physical stuff, right? Because
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Well, as a California girl, you'll know that the Southern California water is not tropical at all. It's
Right.
freezing, right?
Right.
Especially in the wintertime, right? So yeah, most guys quit because of the cold, not because of the physical
Wow.
stuff. But I remember being in the surf zone, freezing, and saying to myself, "Oh my God, this is miserable. I'm just going to count 5 waves." That was my horizon. Someone's horizon might be, I'm going to take 10 breaths or 5 breaths, right? So it's all up to that person. And I think the subjectivity or the ability to pick the proper horizon can be manipulated during the event. So in other words, you can pick a horizon if you feel like, oh man, that's a little too long, shorten the horizon, and then try that, and then just. But the fact is, if you're doing the act, you're already in progress. You're already ahead of the game, because you're in the move the horizon, pick the horizon processes, and you can just start shifting as you go and feeling what's right for you.
I love that. And I think that is why celebrating our small wins is so huge, because that's giving yourself the dopamine to then pick the next goal, right? Yeah. I noticed that when I was doing that, like when I was starting the podcast and I would learn something new or do something great, create a post or whatever it would be, I remember I would be like, yeah, that's so amazing. I love it. And it was like a way to be like excited for the next thing. Right. So that's an example of what I've done with just the podcast, is just celebrating those small wins.
Yeah.
And then it makes me continue.
And I'm glad you said that, because again, people can practice this technique and they don't have to be an uncertainty challenge to practice it. You can do it with anything. I mean, you can do it with your podcast. You can do it with a PowerPoint presentation you're creating. Just understand that this is a deliberate process where you're deliberately picking these horizons. You're deliberately creating certainty, duration, pathway, outcome. And again, the more you exercise this muscle, the more natural it's going to be. The masters of uncertainty, we do this without thinking about it.
Right.
As soon as the shit hits the fan, we begin to do this. And it's funny. My wife, she once said, we were in Virginia Beach, where we've been in the same house for many years. Across the street from us, there's a Navy SEAL. Down the street to the right, there's a SEAL. Down the street to the left, there's a SEAL, right? And I remember my wife saying, I'm glad these guys are in the neighborhood, because if something went wrong, I could go to them and they'd act like you act. And I said, what do you mean by that? It's like, all of you guys, whenever the what hits the fan, all of you just calm down and you start solving the problem. You just start working. And all that is it's a shifting horizon. It's creating DPOs and working through it.
Wow, that's so, like I said, that's why this is gold. This is absolute gold. Okay, so you share actually 6 factors that Navy SEALs do, or elite performers. And so moving into the next one that you share is staying calm.
Yes. Yeah. So I shared 2. There's the move horizons. That's the DPO, that concept. Keep going is
Keep going.
Or excuse me. Meaningful horizons is, I think, keep going is meaningful horizons, which is you're going to pick the right horizon. And then staying cool is this ability to manage your autonomic arousal. This is in essence the buying down uncertainty piece of it, or buying down anxiety piece of it. As our autonomic arousal goes up, there are, amygdala gets tickled. We have physiological responses in our system that happen because of that. Our breathing changes. It gets fast and rapid and short. Our vision starts to focus and tunnel. We can use visual techniques and breathing and respiratory techniques to, in fact, reverse that process. The physiological sigh is a way that allows us to blow out the CO2 from our system and bring our autonomic arousal down, calm ourselves. Because what's happening, what we have to understand, again, neurologically, is as our autonomic arousal goes up, again, amygdala starts to get tickled, our frontal lobe, our conscious decision-making part of our brain, is beginning to recede. And our limbic part of our brain, our lizard brain, is starting to move forward. In the most extreme cases, what happens is called autonomic overload or amygdala hijack. This is when our frontal lobe, our conscious decision-making part of our brain, has gone all the way back, and we are now, and our limbic is forward, and we're now acting without thinking. Okay, this comes in very handy for things like jumping out of the way of a moving train or pulling your hand off a hot stove, right? But for most cases, we want our frontal lobe, our decision-making brain, engaged. And so what these breathing techniques and breathing tools do, and these visual tools do, is they bring down your autonomic arousal. They bring your frontal lobe back online and allow you to begin this moving horizons process. Because if our frontal lobe is starting to get disengaged, we're not going to be able to shift horizons or move horizons properly, because we'll be in limbic hijack there. But the breathing and visual tools that I outline in the book allow us to manipulate that autonomic arousal in very meaningful ways. And what we have to understand is we can do that. We can do that in both directions. We can increase our autonomic arousal. In other words, get more alert and get more excited. That's some of the Wim Hof breathing. Wim Hof breathing is focused around that. We can decrease autonomic arousal, often much more necessary in uncertainty, challenge, stress. We want to decrease autonomic arousal, get our brains back online. But we can also keep our autonomic arousal at the same level it is, right? Sometimes we're in this state of arousal. We're like, oh my gosh, I'm perfect right now. I don't need to go up. I don't need to go down. I'm right where I need to be. Box breathing is perfect for that. And we've all heard about box breathing. So box breathing actually maintains our current level of autonomic arousal. So these are all physiological ways we can manipulate our system to get exactly what we want in terms of how we want to perform.
Yeah, like I said, this is gold. Because this is, like you said, for example, if a sniper is trying to hit their target, if they're not staying calm in that moment and present and making conscious decisions, forget it, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So it's so key. It's basically what he's explaining, just in simple terms, is when we are in fight or flight, basically our conscious mind is non-existent. We're reacting to the situation, and that is where, and actually this is very fascinating. I just shared an interview recently, and she talks about EMDR, and I know you mentioned this in your book, and I didn't know of this before, and it's actually quite fascinating when there's trauma, especially when there's been an experience of trauma, we get into fight or flight of how to handle that situation. Everybody does different things: fight, flight, freeze, fawn. And so our conscious mind is offline. And so EMDR, to my understanding, is a way to bring that back online so that you could recall the trauma and then be able to have a different relationship. Is that right? Is that
No,
how
it is right. I mean, it's what you're doing is you are mitigating the autonomic response. So what, and therapists use this for PTSD, and what they'll do is they'll have the patient recall the trauma. And as that patient begins to have that autonomic response from that trigger, they'll put them in EMDR, and that starts to de-emphasize the trigger. So much of our response or our stress or anxiety it comes from these triggers that trigger our physiology. And so and again, therapists do this, and EMDR is something. It's a very powerful tool. It's great for just calming your system. You can't do it in public because it looks weird. But you can, in between meetings or something, really calm yourself by doing EMDR. But yeah, it's a codified therapeutic practice now, and they're basically using this to, over time, bring down that basically de-emphasize that trigger. So you're not. It's hard to get rid of trauma, but what you're doing is you're mitigating and in the best case, completely getting rid of the autonomic emotional response that comes with that trigger. So if someone at the back end of this therapy thinks about that event, they're no longer triggered. They can actually think objectively, non-emotionally about the experience.
So great. Going back to the keep going, which is the second component of this 6 factors, keep going. So obviously, I think this is where most people stop, right? Because they hit a wall because it's hard and it's uncomfortable. And like you said, the SEAL training, the cold is what most people end at. And that's basically where they feel just paralyzed by the freezing weather or whatnot. And so they have a problem to keep going through it. And so how do you recommend people get on the other side of that hard thing? Because I know there's, obviously ice baths are one of the tools used to push through hard things, because once you get past this certain point, it becomes not easy, but you're able to maintain and keep going through the 3 minutes of the ice bath challenge, if we want to say. So what is your advice for somebody to keep going when they feel like paralyzed by this hard thing?
Yeah, a couple things there. First of all, the first quick bit of advice is to pick a horizon that's short and meaningful and doable, right? That could be, I'm going to take 3 breaths before I get into the ice bath. That's my first, whatever that is. However, let me expound a little bit more deeply on this, because what we have to recognize is in the conduct or training or rehearsal of this stuff, it is impossible to rehearse uncertainty. Okay, but that's paradoxical, because uncertainty is by definition something we've never experienced before, right?
Right.
So that's the bad news, is you can't rehearse uncertainty. The good news is you can inoculate yourself to fear and stress and anxiety depending on the situation, the context. Or in other words, like I said, so a couple examples. First of all, if you get in the ice bath every single day for 2 weeks, you're going to find it easier to get in the ice bath over time. You really are. Skydiving, there were times we'd go on skydiving jump trips to train, and we do like 60 jumps in 1 week. Okay, so by week 3, you're on your 30th jump. I'm not feeling as nervous again anymore about jumping, because I've started to inoculate myself into that environment. Okay, but the inoculation has to be a repetitive action inside of that particular stress event. So in other words, you have to skydive a bunch, you have to ice bath a bunch. So you now, one of the reasons why you can inoculate is because you're mitigating uncertainty now. You're not uncertain about it anymore. All right. However, here's the good news. There is a part of our brain neuroscientists have discovered called, and it's a small part, it's the middle area, but it's called the anterior mid cingulate cortex. Okay, this small part of the brain, they found that it actualizes during times when people are anticipation of a challenge or hard thing, and in doing a hard thing. Okay, that's when it really starts to activate. They've also found that when we actually do hard things, this part of the brain grows. Okay, so what this means is, as that part of the brain grows, that means the ability to step into doing hard things becomes more routine. It becomes easier for one to do the more they exercise this part of our brain. This can be anything, by the way, Erica. This can be anything we don't feel like doing. It could be like, I don't feel like working out today. If you go work out, you're exercising part of the brain. I don't feel like starting that conversation. If you do that, anything we do that we don't feel like doing that's going to be hard, this part of the brain activates, and we're gonna be growing it. So the good news is, anytime we choose to do something hard or do something we don't necessarily want to do, we're exercising, we are growing our brain. And that's great, because the more you do that, the more you will be able to step into hardship. It doesn't mean it's going to be less hard. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean you're not going to have to really shift your horizons quite rapidly. Doesn't mean there's not going to be fear involved. But what it does mean is you'll get more used to doing it. And I really am convinced this is what you see when you see successful people out there who are really good at. They've just been very successful. These are people who, if you rewind the clock, I guarantee you're going to find time after time where they stepped into hard stuff. They were okay doing hard stuff. And we know, just again, these are philosophical things that we know. I think it's cool that we're now neuroscientifically proving them to be true.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such gold. So before I continue, I want to make sure to honor your time. I want to get in the second part of the 6 factors.
Yes.
Do you have a little extra time?
I do. Yeah, let's go a little extra. We'll get into it.
Okay, please. All right. Thank you. So the second 3 are really important. This goes back to your first book, which is your attributes. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned offline, when you learn your attributes and how to strengthen your attributes, and also to know which ones are your strengths and weaknesses, it can really help you excel in a lot in life. And I think it's so key, especially when I was talking about for teenagers these days, so that they have confidence in their own abilities. And so the second part, you talk about attributes, identities, and
objectives.
Objectives.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about attributes a bit, even though we talked about in the first interview, which I'll include it in the show notes because that was such a dynamite conversation. And you went into obviously the whole spiel of that. But attributes, why is this so important as far as handling uncertainty?
Yeah, no, you're right. This is a whole podcast in of itself, as you and I know. But just to get to the quick of it, these attributes, these qualities about us, and these are things like adaptability, resilience, perseverance, situation awareness, curiosity. These attributes, first of all, we all have all of them, but the difference in each one of us are the levels to which we have each one of them. So I'm like a level 6 on adaptability, which means when the environment changes around me outside of my control, it's very easy for me to go with the flow and roll with it. Someone else might be a level 3 on adaptability, which means the same thing happens to them. There's friction there. It's difficult for them to do it. They're still adaptable because all human beings are. All this to say is if you look at your attributes, and we have an assessment tool that allows you to stack them, right? If you look at your attributes from 1, your highest one, all the way to your lowest one to 41, that order is in fact how you behave at your most raw. Okay, so it's how you prioritize your behavior when you are in deep challenge, uncertainty, and stress. When you're not thinking, this is how you prioritize. So in other words, if someone is, say, high decisive and low patience, okay, that means at their most raw, without thinking, they're going to make decisions very rapidly, and they're going to move. They're going to want to move fast. Okay, that comes with it some advantages. Obviously, we can think of those immediately. It also comes with it some blind spots that people have to be aware of in uncertainty, challenge, and stress. But all this to say is part of the thing we have to understand about ourselves is how we show up. I kind of relate it to us being all different types of cars. We're all different. Some of us are Ferraris, some of us are Jeeps, some of us are SUVs. But there's no judgment there because the Jeep can do things the Ferrari can't do, and the Ferrari can do things the Jeep can't do. But it behooves us to figure out what kind of vehicle we are, because now we know what we have and what kind of vehicle we're heading into uncertainty with. So the long short of the attributes conversation is, if we understand our unique attributes profile, our fingerprint, we now know, oh, wait a second, this is actually how I show up when I'm at my most raw. And that's actually a pretty good superpower, not only to know about ourselves, but also to know about our teammates.
So good. And I'll make sure to include the assessment in the show notes. I actually haven't taken it yet. So I think this weekend, my husband and I are going to do it. I'm kind of curious.
Oh, good. Yeah, please do. Yeah.
I mean, I think I think our self-discovery is so essential so that we know really what, know ourselves more, I think is so critical, right?
Well, also, what we'll do is we'll give your listeners a coupon code. So if you put in the show notes, we'll give a coupon code so they can get a discount on it. So.
All right, I'll get that offline. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. So identity, this is a big one. I talk about it a lot because I truly think your identity is one of the most powerful forces.
Yeah.
And it is literally, you will remain in alignment with your identity at all costs, I believe.
Yeah.
And so this comes down, like I share this a lot, that like my identity, I am someone that is I'm seeking optimal health. And so I live my lifestyle according to the identity I see for myself. I'm a healthy, fit, productive woman. I don't know. I'm just throwing out, those are some of my things that I align myself with. And so if I consider myself a fit, healthy woman and I seek optimal health, I'm going to act according to that identity. So that means I go to the gym. Mm-hmm. I have a health routine. I prepare my meals at home, like
you say no to cigarettes.
Yeah. So, and so on and so on. So it's your identity is absolutely critical. And I believe the only way you could have a lasting result is if your identity is in alignment with your goals, right?
Yes. Well, yes. And what we have to recognize about identity in these, and I agree that the two most important or most powerful words I think in the human language are "I am," because whatever comes after that shapes your behavior, it shapes your whole identity. What we have to recognize is that we as human beings are in fact a collection of I ams that we've basically collected and stacked on along the way. And they could be very important. They could be benign, right? I mean, it could be, I went to this high school. I played this sport. I'm a Navy SEAL. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a Metallica fan. Whatever those are, okay, those all are things that we carry with us. Now, every one of those identities, to some degree, comes with them some rules and conditions that define how you behave inside of that identity. And no matter how small it is, there are some rules and conditions. Your identity of being a healthy, fit, productive woman comes with it some rules and conditions that allow you to behave in that way. Those rules and conditions are influencing our behavior all the time, but especially during stress, challenge, and uncertainty. And what we have to recognize is during stress, challenge, and uncertainty, we are going to behave towards the identity, whatever identity we are prioritizing the most in that moment. Now, sometimes that works out really well. Okay. When I was overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan, my Navy SEAL identity was prioritized. That was great. Okay. There were some times, though, we were on target, something would happen, and I'd prioritize my husband father identity first, right? Maybe we had civilians we had to take care of or something. So the husband father had to come out. But those behaviors still those behaviors still inform the process. So all this to say, part of our success in uncertainty is to begin to understand the identities we're carrying with us, and in doing so, understand why we behave the way we do. Because sometimes we behave in ways that we don't realize we're behaving that way because it's an identity. This is why you can see one sports fan beat the crap out of another sports fan. And then when they're in front of the judge is like, what were you thinking? The guy's like, I wasn't thinking. I didn't know what I was doing. Oh, it's because they were behaving towards an identity. They didn't recognize that they were behaving that way because it's an identity they carried. And so this
Wow.
is very powerful in terms of how we behave. It's not only that powerful in how we behave, our physiology is based on this too. If you study DID, dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder, they did studies on folks with DID, and in those studies, they're fascinating. There were people they saw who had multiple, like 12 different personalities. Some of these
Wow.
folks would change personalities like 5 times within an hour. Okay. And in some cases, the same person in one identity would be allergic to something. And then when they shifted identity, the allergy would go away. There
That's
were cases
insane.
where in one identity, one person would have an eye color and their eye color would change when they changed identity. I mean, it is absolutely fascinating, incredible what the brain is capable of doing to our physiology. And so now
Wow.
I'm at the less extreme levels, what we have to understand is whatever we put behind I am, we should expect behaviors that way, and we can manipulate this positively or negatively. And in uncertainty, challenge, and stress, if we're cognizant of this, we can actually pick and choose the identity that's most appropriate for that particular environment of uncertainty. Right? If it's an environment of uncertainty where a bunch of chaos is happening, then maybe my Navy SEAL identity is the way to do it. If it's an environment of uncertainty where my teenagers are, getting, lippy, or mouthing off or whatever, or getting, testosterone filled, then maybe my husband father identity has to come forth, right? So whatever those environments are, we have to and can actualize the identity that's most powerful in that environment.
Wow. Okay. So, what would you recommend for somebody to know their identities? Should we jot down possibly like all the I ams that we associate with, and
Yeah,
then choose like our core identities that we sit in mostly throughout
I think
our
so. I
day?
think in the book I outline, an exercise where you can kind of jot it down and be honest with yourself, all the way from the heavy ones to the benign ones, right? And then it just be again the number one rule here, the number one strategy is knowledge, is understanding, because as soon as you know, then you can start to apply. Once you start to understand your identities, then they will be on the front of your brain when you're starting to get into uncertainty, challenge, and stress. What
Okay.
is that doing? A, it's giving you choices, but B, it's also bringing your conscious mind back online, right? So you may find that in this list of things, there's some ideas. You know what? Those don't apply to me anymore. I'm just going to get rid of those. You might find that these are actually really cool. I'm going to use these. You might actually find, hey, I want to build a new identity. There's an identity that I want to actually, for me, coming out of the Navy SEALs, that's a pretty big identity to not have anymore, because I'm not a Navy SEAL. I'm a former Navy SEAL. Okay. But coming out of it, I said, you know what? I'm going to put that on a shelf, and I'm going to build a new one. I'm going to build an author identity and an entrepreneur identity, and so it just allows us a lot more flexibility in not only how we operate in stress and challenge and uncertainty, but also in overall life.
Oh, so good. Just to touch on the last one, the objectives, I think this is really important, because I think when we have a goal, let's say somebody, for example, that 400-pound man that wanted to probably lose weight, he wanted to be a runner, he has that big goal in mind, but I assume there's a bigger objective behind that. Like there's a why behind the reason he
Yeah.
wants that goal.
Yeah.
And so how does that play in with uncertainty?
Yeah, the idea is to turn the why or the purpose into an objective. So, in other words, George's why, his purpose is he wanted to get healthy. That's a very big, kind of soft, ethereal thing. And so, what he did very deliberately said, my objective, I'm going to run a marathon. That was his objective. He turned something that was kind of soft and ethereal into something concrete inside of it, begin to DPO and shift horizons. So that's the idea. Create an objective inside of which you can start to pick and shift horizons. You can chunk into smaller pieces because my purpose when I was a younger kid was I wanted to serve my country. I wanted to be someone special. I wanted to be a warrior, all that stuff. Okay. My objective become a Navy SEAL. Now, of course, that objective is pretty big too. So I had to chunk that into smaller ones. I had to make it through. I had to get to SEAL training, then make it through SEAL training, and even in SEAL training, make it through Hell Week, all this stuff. But it still allowed the ability to shift horizons. Your objective might be become healthy, and you have cancer, and the purpose is be healthy again. The objective is beat cancer, right? That's something you can begin to create horizons around. So all this to say is those are driving us as well. We just have to understand that during this process, we have an objective. We have to understand that once we have it, it's there, but we have to let it go. We can't stare at the entire elephant, but it's still there. It's still driving our behavior.
So good. Okay, Rich, I don't want to take up your whole morning. So there's so much more goodness we could dive into. And I know the last part of your book goes into leadership, how to lead yourself and others. And there's just so much gold. I know we touched on leadership in our first conversation. So again, I'll plug that in the show notes. Highly encourage you to listen to that first episode because there's so much goodness. But yeah, everything you shared today, like I said, just knowing those 6 factors could really change someone's life to, of course, eliminate more stress, which would be nice because stress kills us.
Yeah,
there's good stress, but there's of course the bad stress that's killing a lot of us. So that will be gold for anybody right now, especially in times we are today. So I just thank you for all that you've shared today. Of course, the book will be in the show notes. So grab that. Like I said, it's an easy read. So just dive right in and learn everything he just taught today, highlight the heck out of it because it's so good. So anyways, Rich, I just thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and just for, the goodness you're providing to us today and just for our average people out there that admire Navy SEALs as yourself. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Erica. It's at the end of the day, none of us are average. We're all above average in our own way. So, and I think it's
Sure.
it's fantastic for us to actualize that and reach our potential. So I appreciate you being such a supporter. And so thank you for that. And yeah, it was a pleasure being here again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Appreciate you.